Welcome back to This Explainer. Today, we're unraveling a genuinely tragic paradox. We're looking at a story of unprecedented industrial success that, well, quite literally manufactured its own doom. We're talking about Pitcher, Oklahoma. Once upon a time, this was a bustling, incredibly wealthy mining boomtown. Today, it's an actively toxic, completely abandoned wasteland. So how on earth does a town go from fueling a massive global war effort to becoming entirely uninhabitable?
Okay, let's dive into this, because the ultimate irony of Pitcher's entire existence is just how incredibly fast it all happened. Back in late 1913, there was this massive lead and zinc ore strike on Quapaw tribal land. And people flooded in so fast that newspapers at the time literally reported Pitcher was born overnight. But, as you're going to see, less than a century later, it would be erased just as quickly. A vibrant, bustling community that practically sprang out of nowhere was legally dissolved in just a matter of months in 2009. Wild, right?
Now, to really wrap our heads around how this happened, you first have to grasp the sheer, staggering scale of Pitcher's prosperity. We're not talking about some tiny mom-and-pop mining operation here. Between 1917 and 1947, the Pitcher field produced over $20 billion in ore. $20 billion. Just let that scale sink in for a second. At the absolute peak of this boom, around 1926, the town's population swelled to over 14,000 residents. You had over 14,000 men working down in those underground mines and another 4,000 running all the support businesses up on the surface.
And this wealth wasn't just staying local. It had massive global significance. Listen to this. Pitcher provided over 50% of the entire United States supply of lead and zinc used during World War I. Half the country's supply. That is an immense patriotic and economic contribution. But, and here is the truly heartbreaking reality of Pitcher's story, that exact same extreme prosperity, the very engine that drove their success, was simultaneously quietly manufacturing their permanent destruction. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer volume of the byproduct it shows. Decades of totally unrestricted underground mining created this devastating waste. Imagine, for a second, just looking out your living room window and seeing massive, 200-foot-tall mountains of waste rock looming right there in the middle of your town. The locals called this toxic byproduct chat, and it added up to 120 million tons of debris. And this wasn't just some harmless, annoying dust. No, we are talking about towering, man-made mountains absolutely laced with lead, cadmium, and other really dangerous heavy metals.
And this leads us to a dramatic irony that honestly is really hard to stomach today. Because these chat piles were just everywhere, right? They were just part of the everyday scenery. So the residents had absolutely no idea how dangerous they were. You had unaware children literally riding their bikes up and down these toxic mountains for fun. The town even used this poison gravel for their own driveways. They even used it to pave the local school playgrounds. Without even knowing it, the community was spreading heavily lead-contaminated materials straight into their own homes and lives for decades.
So how did they find out? Well, the realization of this environmental nightmare played out in slow motion. It really started back in 1979 when contaminated mine water suddenly turned the local Tar Creek bright, unnatural orange, completely killing off the fish. By 1983, things had gotten so dire that the EPA stepped in and designated a 40-square-mile area as a federal Superfund site. And get this, the contamination levels were reportedly even worse than the infamous Love Canal disaster. Throughout the mid-90s, the EPA actually tried removing topsoil from people's front yards. But honestly, it just wasn't enough to stop the poison. It was everywhere.
And the result of all that prolonged, completely unavoidable exposure? It's captured in some truly horrifying health statistics. Look at this. In 1994, a study revealed that 34% of all children in Pitcher were suffering from lead poisoning. Just 2 years later, another survey showed 38.3% of children were testing way above the CDC's maximum safe limits for blood lead levels. In the neighboring community of Carden, it was a staggering 63%. Today, we know that lead poisoning at these kinds of levels causes permanent neurological damage. We're talking severe impacts on a child's IQ, their learning abilities, and their behavior. Essentially, the massive prosperity of the past had directly poisoned the children of the future.
To really ground this data in human reality, though, let's consider former residents like Karen. She grew up in Pitcher, developed severe dyslexia, and has an IQ of 65. She's publicly wondered if growing up right in the middle of Pitcher's toxic dust contributed to those lifelong struggles. And it is absolutely vital to acknowledge this factual human element.
Without over-sensationalizing it, we have to recognize the tragic, permanent cost that kind of massive industrial negligence exacts on actual human potential.
So, the crucial point is, the poison above ground? That wasn't even the only existential threat to Pitcher. In 2006, a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers study revealed a genuinely terrifying structural reality. All those decades of unregulated, frantic digging had turned the earth right beneath the town into a hollow honeycomb. An unbelievable 86% of the buildings in Pitcher, and yeah, that includes the town's school, were severely undermined and at high risk of sudden, catastrophic collapse.
Pitcher was, for all intents and purposes, a ticking time bomb. Think about it. Not only was the surface heavily poisoned by a cocktail of heavy metals, but the actual physical foundation of Pitcher itself was a massive collapse risk from abandoned mine tunnels. At literally any moment, the ground could just open up and swallow the town whole. These residents were completely trapped. They had toxic mountains looming above them and a fragile, crumbling abyss right beneath their feet.
And right smack in the middle of this unbelievable crisis is a really bizarre, bureaucratic irony. Just across the state line sits the town of Treese, Kansas. Now, Treese shared the exact same mining field, the exact same toxic chat piles, the exact same poison dust. Yet, purely because of an invisible state line on a map, it fell under a completely different EPA jurisdiction. So while Pitcher was fast-tracked for federal buyouts and total evacuation, Treese was initially refused. Officials insisted their land could somehow still be cleaned. It actually took a rare act of Congress in 2010 to finally grant those Treese residents the very same buyoutscapes. Bureaucracy, right?
But for the people of Pitcher, nature actually ended up delivering the final, devastating blow before the government could fully intervene. On May 10, 2008, a massive EF4 tornado tore a path directly through the town. It was completely devastating. It killed 6 people and destroyed or severely damaged over 100 homes. For a lot of the residents who had been fiercely, stubbornly resisting the idea of leaving the only homes they'd ever known, this catastrophic event, it finally broke their resolve.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how absolute the population collapse was following that tornado and the mandatory 2009 EPA evacuation order. I mean, look at this drop. From a bustling peak of over 14,000 residents in the 1920s down to about 1,600 at the turn of the millennium. And then the population just absolutely plummeted. By the time the 2010 census rolled around, there were exactly 20 people left recorded in the entire area. Just 20!
You can imagine the mood during this final exodus. It was deeply somber. The media was there, capturing this surreal, slow-motion abandonment, and the overarching sentiment from these totally exhausted residents as they packed up their lives and accepted federal relocation checks was just tragic. After fighting for their town for decades, they simply wished they weren't there anymore. The immense psychological toll of living in a poisoned, crumbling, and now storm-ravaged town had just become way too much to bear.
Yet even then, a stubborn, incredibly resilient few refused to let go. They actually proudly called themselves the Chat Rats, bravely choosing to stay right where they were despite the buyouts. It really humanizes the end of this town when you look at folks like Alyssa Logan. She graduated in 2009 in a final high school class of just 11 students, literally walking across a graduation stage in a town that practically no longer existed. Or Gary Linderman, the local pharmacist. He vowed to keep his pharmacy doors open until the very last resident left. He really became the anchor to that last man standing narrative, ultimately staying until he passed away in 2015.
Let's move to and see how this builds toward the actual legal death of Pitcher. By June 2009, all the federal relocation checks were completely issued. Just a few months later, in September, the city officially canceled its incorporated status. And finally, the last nail in the coffin, on November 26, 2013, the municipality was officially legally dissolved. Just like that. The boomtown that was born overnight back in 1913 was literally and systematically wiped completely off the map.
But here's the thing. Just because the town is legally gone, definitely doesn't mean the problem is actually solved. The state estimates it's going to take approximately 50 more years to fully remediate the remaining 110 million tons of toxic chat. Pitcher isn't just some quaint, empty ghost town you can go visit. It is an actively toxic landscape that is going to require millions of dollars and decades of nonstop labor just to make it safe for the surrounding environment.
And frankly, for many people involved, that progress is entirely insufficient. Environmental advocate Rebecca Jim has repeatedly gone on the record stating that the cleanup progress over the decades has simply been not good enough and nowhere near fast enough.
I mean, even as recently as 2021, Tar Creek was listed as one of the 10 most endangered rivers in the entire United States. Today, the Quapaw Nation has really stepped up, taking over major contracts to accelerate the monumental job of hauling away these toxic mountains left behind on their ancestral land.
Yet, amidst all of this incredible ruin, there is still this really beautiful, lingering spark of community resilience. Check this out. Every single year, former residents and those few remaining holdouts still gather together to host a Christmas parade, marching right down those empty streets. They come together to celebrate their memories and keep their history alive in a town that, legally speaking, doesn't even exist anymore. It is such a powerful, moving testament to the people who survived this massive industrial tragedy.
Pitcher's story serves as a stark, unforgettable warning about the permanence of our industrial footprint. Pitcher is gone, but the poison remains. And it really makes you wonder, when you look at similar cases like the asbestos-laden town of Wittenoom in Australia, or the abandoned mining town of Gilman, Colorado, what other towns out there right now are quietly building their own demise? How many communities are completely unaware that their current prosperity is just the down payment on their future erasure? Think about that, and we'll see you on the next Explainer.